In the spring of 1937, a heavily pregnant woman named Suba crashes into a hospital in Tikrit, Iraq. With Suba is her 12-year-old son named Sabawi. He's seriously unwell, probably suffering from the later stages of smallpox, blackening skin, organ failure from infection, severe pain across his entire body. Among poor families in rural Iraq, smallpox is a tragically regular illness, and despite the doctor's best efforts, young Sabawi doesn't pull through. For Suba, the loss of her son is too much to bear, and her overwhelming grief soon turns to white-hot anger. She blames the unborn baby in her stomach, telling the hospital staff that he killed his older brother because he wants to be the only man in the family. When she gets home, she tries to slam herself into a wall in order to kill the unborn child. A few days later, she throws herself under a moving bus. When the village community tries to intervene, she howls at them, "I'm carrying Satan in my belly." One way or another, though, the baby comes. But Suba is in no state to be a mother. She gives her newborn son away to his maternal uncle, a military officer named Kairala. Uncle Kairala takes the boy under his wing and he gives him a name: Saddam. In Arabic, it means the one who confronts. It couldn't have been a better name. Over the next 40 years, this peasant boy from rural Tikrit will rise to become the most powerful man in Iraq and live up to his mother's expectations for evil and cruelty. But like so many other tyrants and dictators, we have to understand Saddam Hussein's childhood to appreciate his relationship with power and savage rise to supremacy. Young Saddam stays with Uncle Kairala until he's 4 years old, at which point his mother takes him back, but their relationship never properly recovers. With no father figure in the house and a mentally unstable mother, young Saddam finds himself savagely bullied at school and quickly learns that the only way to protect himself is to get comfortable with violence. He might be an easy target for nicknames, but he'll make sure that anybody who gets on his bad side ends up with a bloody nose. Eventually, his mother remarries and Saddam has a stepdad in the house. It's his uncle, Kairala. Marriages between siblings were not unheard of in rural Iraq, so Saddam received no barbs from his classmates about the incestuous nature of his mother's marriage to her own brother. But Saddam did struggle with his new father figure, Uncle Kairala, who was a strict disciplinarian and was happy to put Saddam in his place, often physically, with beatings and lashings for minor transgressions. This would go on to have two key effects on Saddam's psychological development. Firstly, it solidified the idea that violence and power went hand in hand. Secondly, it gave him a troubled relationship with authority, seeing powerful figures as something to be both loved and feared. This problematic relationship with violence and authority would go on to have consequences for more than just Saddam's schoolyard bullies. During his teenage years, a teacher publicly chastises Saddam for bad behaviour. Later that night, a masked adolescent pays that same teacher a visit and puts a bullet through his leg. After this incident, Saddam is expelled from school and his mother Suba also banishes him from his house in Tikrit. Luckily for Saddam, his uncle and father, Kairala, was working in Baghdad, Iraq's capital. Instead of being punished for shooting his own teacher, this whole incident had given him his ticket to move to the big city. Things were looking good. Under the direct supervision of Uncle Kairala, a staunch Arab socialist and Ba'athist, Saddam's burgeoning misadventures would go from schoolyard pranks to political dissidence. In 1957, he joined the Iraqi Ba'athist Party at the age of 20. Just 1 year later, on the 14th of July 1958, there's a coup in Iraq. A left-leaning nationalist by the name of Qasim teamed up with some other fringe political parties, including the Ba'athist Party, to depose Iraq's king, Faisal II. King Faisal, just 23 years old, is taken completely by surprise by Qasim's lightning coup and finds himself stuck in Rihab Palace trying to negotiate with his newfound captors. One of the leaders of the coup, a man named Abdul Salam Arif, promises the king protection if he surrenders to him now without resistance. Left without any choice, the king accepts. But Arif is not a man of his word. Once the king and his family come out of hiding, they're lined up in the palace and shot dead. Faisal's body is hanged in the street, but his advisor, Abd al-Ilah, is tied to a car and dragged through the streets. Eventually, he slips the knot, and a mob descends on him with knives drawn, hacking his body to pieces, which are then displayed around Baghdad. It's a transformative experience for Iraq, which has just gone from a monarchy ruled by Faisal to a republic ruled by the new president, Qasim. For Saddam personally, though, the whole affair teaches him a lesson he'll never forget. No matter how powerful you might think you are, play the game wrong, and this is where it ends. The people aren't powerless at all. In fact, they're terrifying, and it pays to be paranoid. In return for the Ba'athist Party's support for Qasim, Uncle Khairallah is made governor of Baghdad, which puts Saddam in one of Iraq's most powerful families. But it doesn't take long for the cracks to emerge and for Saddam to find a new struggle, this time against the new president Qasim. The disagreement is ideological. The Ba'athist Party had originally backed Qasim's removal of Faisal because the Iraqi monarchy was seen as a Western puppet. The Ba'athists wanted Iraq to be independent and focused on the Arab world, not a puppet state taking orders from London or Washington. Unfortunately, however, while the Ba'athists were looking to Iraqi independence, Qasim was now cozying up with Moscow, and it was looking like he might move Iraq away from the Western world and towards the Soviet sphere of influence, skipping straight past true independence along the way. Soon, Qasim would be hearing stories that the Ba'athists weren't happy. Paranoid and insecure, he cracks down, even sending Uncle Khairallah to a strict stint in prison. For Saddam, seeing his uncle fall victim to a blind purge is enough, and a conspiracy is launched to remove Qasim directly by ambushing him as he drives through Baghdad. It's a simple plan. 6 conspirators, including Saddam, would set up on the narrowest section of Al-Rashid Street in Baghdad, and once Qasim's car slowed down to navigate the bottleneck, they would pounce, ripping through his vehicle with submachine gun fire. And so, on October the 7th, 1959, with the conspirators waiting in ambush, Qasim's black Chevrolet comes into view on Al-Rashid Street. But young Saddam is a bit too trigger-happy. Before Qasim's car slows down in the narrowest choke point, he prematurely opens fire, and he doesn't meet his mark. The other conspirators, seeing their one chance begin to slip away, open fire, sinking bullet after bullet into the presidential vehicle as it speeds away. It's not perfect, but they all see Qasim take at least 2 shots, so mission accomplished. Saddam makes another mistake that day, though. In all the panic and commotion, he manages to shoot himself in the leg during their escape, a detail which he will later have his propaganda officials scrub clean from the record. Still, though, they had done the deed, and their mission was a success. After fleeing the scene, Saddam and his conspirators head to a safe house where he can have that self-inflicted bullet wound to his thigh treated. It's while he sits with his comrades, having the bullet pried out from his leg, that they receive the worst news possible. Qasim was very much still alive and out for vengeance on his would-be assassins. The bullets had only struck his arm and shoulder. Saddam's own goal to his leg had probably been more life-threatening than Qasim's grazing injuries. But he has bigger problems to worry about than his leg now. If Qasim finds him, he's as good as dead. So Saddam will have to flee Baghdad. In fact, he'll have to flee Iraq altogether, as Qasim turns over every stone to try and find those responsible for this wanton act of treason. Injured, isolated, scared, a 22-year-old Saddam would need to make the grueling journey into Syria, where he would be safe from Qasim's retaliation. The later propaganda myth is that Saddam heroically marched from Tikrit to Syria, famously swimming across the river Tigris under the cover of darkness. The more likely reality is that he was limping between car rides, cowering below the window screen and whimpering in agony with each change of vehicle. One way or another, though, Saddam made it to Syria alive, and from there he was able to travel to Egypt, where he would have other exiled Iraqi Baathists to keep him company while he laid low. Saddam would go on to spend 3 years in Egypt between 1960 and 1963, during which time he tried to pursue a law degree at the University of Cairo. Unfortunately, his talent for political activism didn't translate well into the classroom. After a year of study, Saddam gave up the books and returned to a life of idleness and exile. But Saddam wouldn't be stuck on his backside for very long. In February 1963, the Ba'athist Party in Iraq tried once again to overthrow Qasim, but this time They were successful. In a brutal two-day coup, the Ba'athist Party had managed to oust that same man that Saddam had tried to assassinate 3 years ago. Qasim was quickly put on a show trial and sentenced to execution by firing squad. The entire process was actually televised on Iraqi television, with Qasim being shot several times at point-blank range, and then his corpse was beaten and mutilated afterwards. Up to 5,000 of Qasim's civilian supporters would suffer a similar fate as the new Ba'athist regime started going door to door in Baghdad, booting down the entrance to private houses and summarily executing anyone suspected of sympathy for Qasim. For a now 25-year-old Saddam watching all this go down from Egypt, Qasim's overthrow brought mixed feelings. On the one hand, his political enemy was now dead, and his own party, the Ba'athists, were finally in power in Iraq, wielding it with much of that same brutality Saddam had always hoped to see. On the other hand, though, it all happened without him. When Qasim finally met his end, Saddam was just a spectator on the sidelines. All the glory would now go to his comrades in Baghdad, and Saddam would just be some minor footnote in the glorious revolution. Luckily for Saddam, though, his old friends in the party hadn't forgotten him or his valiant attempt on Qasim's life all those years ago. He was flown back to Baghdad at the Ba'athist Party's behest, and a calculated PR campaign was run to make Saddam an honorary member of the revolution, even orchestrating photographs like this one, where Saddam stands atop a tank with other leaders of the Ba'athist coup. It was all looking quite rosy for Saddam, who was now a senior figure in the Ba'athist Party and on his way up the ranks. But Iraq had other plans. In what should be a surprise to nobody who's gotten this far into the video, there was yet another monumental shift in power within Iraq in November 1963. This time, a man named Abdul Salam Arif, who had up until this stage been working with the Ba'athists against Qasim, now himself turned against the Ba'athists in an enormous political purge that rocked the balance of power within Iraq. Saddam was a high-profile target, and his meteoric rise through the Iraqi government came to a swift end. By October 1944, Saddam was no longer at his desk within the Ba'athist Party. Now, he was in a jail cell as a political prisoner, serving a life sentence. He was to serve his time at Bugrat Salman, a notorious desert prison in the south of Iraq, far away from Baghdad. For Saddam, however, who was no stranger to turbulent politics, violent criminals, or the insolence of office, this didn't seem to affect his mood at all. In fact, he had had the opportunity to escape to Syria before going to prison, but actively chose to remain in Iraq and risk time behind bars. While inside, he made use of the library. But this time, instead of brushing up on international law like he did in Cairo, he started to take on a new area of interest: the life and times of another infamous dictator, Joseph Stalin. We can imagine Saddam in his cell with nothing for company but the stories of this poor Georgian boy from the outskirts of Russia, climbing the ranks within his own party during coup after coup after coup, before finally ascending to rule over all of Russia. It was all looking very similar to Saddam's life so far. Incidentally, Stalin had also done a stint in a Russian prison, although in a penal colony in Siberia, not baking in the desert of Iraq. Either way, though, Saddam had a new role model to look up to, even basing his notorious moustache on Uncle Joe's. Things would continue this way until 1966, when Saddam was somehow able to escape. We don't know the details, but the most likely answer is that some of his Ba'athist allies on the outside had been able to bribe Saddam's guards into looking the other way while he wandered off into the desert. When Saddam arrived in Baghdad, he was awarded for his loyalty to the party and made the Deputy Secretary of the Regional Command. It's his first real taste of power within the Ba'athist Party, and he wields it fantastically. By September of that same year, he's made such incredible progress within the Ba'athist Party that he's given the green light to establish a new party-loyal security service, which he is permitted almost complete personal control over. Now Saddam has some muscle, and he'll soon be needing it. In July 1968, yet another coup sweeps through Iraq. This time it's the Ba'athists again, and this time it goes smoothly, without bloodshed. But it's not exactly peaceful either. Saddam personally escorts the dethroned Iraqi president to an airplane ready to take him out of the country. The entire march Saddam holds a pistol squarely against the ex-president's head, just in case he decides not to go. In reward for his hard work, the Ba'athist party leader and now leader of all Iraq, Ahmed Hassan, decides to make Saddam Hussein vice president. He's now within reaching distance of the ultimate seat of power. But although Saddam is power-hungry, he's not foolhardy. All those years in prison reading through Stalin's example have impressed upon him the importance of biding his time. And like Stalin, Saddam plans to build up his power by operating in the shadows. While President Ahmed Hassan takes the limelight, Saddam works quietly but effectively over the next 10 years to become the most powerful man in Iraq, and he's not at all shy about getting his hands dirty in the process. With some ingenious reforms to Iraq's oil industry, the creation of new security powers, and a brutal, and I mean brutal, series of recriminations against the Kurdish population, Saddam solidifies his reputation as a strongman and slowly turns Iraq from an unstable but relatively open country to a fledgling police state. Many years after this, the CIA would go on to commission a dossier of the psychological profiles of the world's major dictators. Saddam Hussein didn't just make the list, but scored highest for the negative traits associated with the world's most evil men. Dr. Gerald Post, the psychiatrist responsible for leading the investigation, described Saddam as a man who rules by terror. He has no hesitation in using brutality as a tool of governance. He was also described as unbelievably paranoid, possibly from his terrible home life, as well as a brutal sadist who took pleasure in the suffering of others, a total control freak who genuinely saw himself as the saviour of Iraq, and a prolific risk-taker who had no qualms about taking big gambles for big payoffs. After 10 years as President Ahmed Hassan's right-hand man, Saddam is ready to roll the dice on the biggest bet of his life, and when it pays off, we'll see that sadism start to take the spotlight. In 1979, President Hassan had begun to formalise negotiations between the state of Iraq and the state of Syria. The idea was that both countries would merge into one massive Arab nation. It was popular on both sides. The Iraqi President Hassan would remain leader of this new nation, and the Syrian leader would take the post of vice president. Can you see the problem, though? Saddam Hussein was holding the seat of vice president, which means if this deal went through, he would lose a lot of power. Admittedly, Saddam would have received a smaller slice of the political pie, but the pie was about to get twice as big. Like a young Caesar, though, Saddam would rather be first man in the village than the second man in Rome, and this threat to his power moved him to act. Luckily for him, the past 10 years of power building left him with a lot of options, perhaps more than President Hassan was aware of. On July 16, 1979, Saddam rolled the dice. He came out in the open and confronted President Hassan for the leadership position. When the two men met, Saddam told the president, "You're not well. Your health is failing. You feel sick. It's time for you to retire." When Hassan tried to protest and explain he was still well enough to work, Saddam restated the line with a different tone. "You're not understanding me. I think you're unwell. It's best you retire now." Hassan saw the threat for what it was, and although he was supposed to be president, everyone within the inner circle knew that in reality, Saddam had the power, the influence, and the muscle. Hassan reluctantly resigned, but for good measure, Saddam had him placed under house arrest. It was an enormous gamble. If Saddam's intimidation move had failed, he could very likely have found himself back in prison for life, or worse, dead. But luckily for him, it worked. Saddam was now the leader of Iraq, but there was still more to do. Although he may have been able to threaten President Hassan out of office, many of his supporters remained within the establishment. For a paranoid sadist like Saddam, this was an unacceptable state of affairs. What happens next is perhaps the most infamous act of politics ever captured on television, and for good reason. It's terrifying. On the 22nd of July 1979, Saddam held an unassuming party meeting at the Al-Qud Conference Hall. All high-ranking Ba'athist party members are ordered to attend. Unbeknownst to the attendees, what they're coming to see is going to be quite the show. and Saddam makes sure the cameras are rolling. He stands at the platform and casually tells everyone in the room that a plot has been uncovered, a plot to assassinate Saddam himself and rip Iraq away from their dear leader. What's worse, those who had intended to betray this government are in this very room, sitting amongst us in the hall. It's a bold-faced lie, and nearly everything else that follows is also false, but it doesn't matter. Saddam wants to send a message, not the truth. After he's finished reading, a slender man named Muti Abdel Hussein Mashhadi is dragged up onto the stage. Until a week ago, he was a very powerful man in Iraq. Now he barely has the strength to make his way to the podium. Once there, he reads a pre-written confession in which he admits to being the ringleader of a conspiracy against Saddam and that he was responsible for corrupting others into his filthy plot. What the audience doesn't know, however, is that Mashhadi has spent the last week being systematically tortured into giving this false confession, and when that didn't work, his wife and children are threatened with that same fate. To save them, all he has to do is comply. While Mashhadi reads his confession, Saddam sits on the side and lights a cigar. His look is not one of grim determination or remorse at having a colleague tortured. Instead, the expression is unmistakable. Glee, satisfaction, amusement. Once Mashhadi is done, Saddam once again takes the centre podium, relights his cigar, and begins to tally off a list of names. Once a name is called, the corresponding individual is ordered out of their seat and taken out of the room. Everyone in the building now sits and sweats and waits off of every single syllable coming out of Saddam's mouth, praying that it is not their name next until everyone in the room is a broken, nervous wreck. After reading out the 68th name on his list, Saddam gleefully praises the remainder of the men assembled in the room and thanks them for their loyalty. Those left inside break into rapturous applause, publicly displaying their loyalty and love for Saddam. Nobody thinks to ask what happened to the 68 souls who were dragged out of their seats, although they'll soon find out. After a very brief show trial, 22 of the 68 men are sentenced to death by firing squad. But there's a twist of procedure. Some of the accused men who survived the trial are forced to participate in the executions. While the 22 convicted men are led out into the courtyard and blindfolded, their former comrades are taken through an opposite hallway where guns are placed in their hands. They're then ordered to go out and shoot their friends and co-workers as a last chance to clear their name and prove their innocence. But it's not a typical execution where everyone is lined up and mown down all at once. Instead, these unwilling executioners are given a specific name that they're responsible for. They must then go out into the courtyard, find their victim, and put a bullet through their head personally. Some of the men are so terrified that they miss their targets altogether, even at point-blank range, and have to sink several bullets into their victims before the grim deed is done. It's unpleasant work. But for Saddam, it's a damn good day at the office. He's removed all of his potential enemies, forced those who he doesn't trust into being complicit in the crime, and most importantly, sent a message to everyone else in the party. While Saddam's in charge, you have two options: absolute loyalty or death. To be even suspected of wrongdoing is enough to see your life very suddenly cut short. It makes him undisputedly the most powerful man in Iraq, and over the next 24 years he'll rule with an absolute iron fist, becoming one of the most infamous dictators in human history, kicking off a brutal 8-year war against Iran, committing crimes against humanity in Iraq's Kurdish region, invading neighbouring countries such as Kuwait, and turning Iraq into a brutally repressive police state that could rival North Korea. It won't last forever though. Like all dictators, a meteoric rise is always followed by a dizzying fall. But that's the subject for another day. Today was just about his rise.